Hi, welcome to Expand Your Us. I'm so glad that you have joined me to hear some thoughts about the upcoming holiday celebrating the life and legacy of Martin Luther King. Um, and so I have some thoughts to share, and I hope that they will help you think about this holiday as we think about how to celebrate and honor his life. As the national holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approaches, I hope we can honor his legacy by confronting our myths. First, let's think about the fact that he is a national hero, lifted up by civil rights leaders, pastors of every creed. In the last few years, he was lifted up by a Dodge Super Bowl commercial, and most recently in Tennessee, by a community group working to ban books about him from public schools. What? If our mythology is to be believed, King is beloved by those who live his legacy and by those actively trying to dismantle his legacy. We need to expect more of ourselves. Pretending like we support a guy whose ideas we wholly reject is not a good look. The genius of Dr. King is that he patiently forced America to confront its own hypocrisy. He dispelled the myths white America believed about themselves and the society they created. This year, as I honor King, I'd like to offer another round of myth busting for your consideration. So in 1966, a Gallup poll measured King's favorability at 33%, while 63% of those polled disapproved of him. This was over 10 years after the Montgomery bus boycott, which launched him to prominence and focused the momentum of the civil rights movement. It was 3 years after he delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech on the Washington Mall, unifying the call for freedom and the need for jobs. This was 1 year after the successful march from Selma to Montgomery, a march that's been thought about and creatively displayed through movies and other ideas, a march that was attempted 3 times, where white and Black civilians linked arms, allowing their conviction and hope to propel them to walk across a bridge and a state, some sacrificing their well-being or their very lives, as civilians and policemen brutally, openly attacked them. The violence broadcast that month woke the conscience of a nation, encouraging the Congress of the United States to support the Voting Rights Bill, a bill that in the last few years has been dismantled. Dr. King was the face of a movement that lifted the spirits of his fellow African American brothers and sisters. Importantly, he also required the gaze of a country to confront the suffering of Black folks by observing the sacrifices they made on the bridge and in other places. Many Americans love our mythology, though, so much that we maintain it even when we see evidence that we are not who we think we are. The civil rights movement worked because it confronted with actual images on televisions that were spreading across America and finally in people's homes. We had to confront the mythology of who we are when we saw how we treated Black people living their everyday lives. Now, are we willing to confront our own mythologies when we have images that confront them? So Dr. King and the SCLC forced the country to observe the actual status quo. Their bravery was remarkable, but it was effective because it created a setting in which African Americans and their white allies were vilified and attacked for doing everyday life, for sitting on a bus on the way to work, for walking across a bridge, or for ordering coffee at a lunch counter. These acts of resistance were brilliant because they were boring. Everyone knows what it's like to order a drink expecting to receive one. Although not many white folks knew what it was like to be Black, they could certainly understand what it meant to be refused service just for existing, to be beaten for walking in your Sunday best. Dr. King and the SCLC reminded the country of visceral, instinctive compassion. The images captured and the scenes witnessed were so uncivil that they did what Walter Brueggemann says. They announced that hurt is to be taken seriously, that hurt is not to be accepted as normal and natural, but is an abnormal and unacceptable condition for humanness. Most folks in the white majority would have argued then and now that our society is not full of hate, but rather people are civil and America is fair, as long as African Americans and other people of color stay in their lane. This is a myth that is thriving today, even after King exposed it as untrue. Even after we have so much evidence now that it's untrue, we still hold on to that myth. This type of delusional break from reality is only possible when compassion and connection with other people and empathy are dead. This is how the antebellum South could be remembered as a place known for genteel manners, kind hospitality, and gorgeous vistas in settings where bodies were chained and whipped and forced to work in the glare of that said gorgeous vista. We can't hold on to both ideas at one time, so we ignore the ugly and we mythologize the good. Dr. King was both wildly unpopular and most effective because he exposed the average citizen to the flaws in their own mythologies. Truth tellers are often avoided. I mean, it started with Cassandra and it continues to today. We're called troublemakers. And Dr. King kept showing the country the truth of the everyday, boring trauma that Black folks experienced, dispelling the delusions that America was a land of respected and kind free people who rewarded hard work. The actions of those in the movement disrupted what felt normal and forced people to realize that there's a huge difference in order and in peace. King called out those of us, and I'm quoting King here, who were more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. He called out those of us who prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And these distinctions hold true today. His actions broke then and break now this mythology of separate but equal, a centuries-long commitment of silence, or it's a commitment of society to silence dissent. Naming inequality is not an act of aggression, but a step toward making peace. Think about how you feel when people name inequality around you. Does it feel aggressive, or does it feel like a step toward peace? This might help you understand how you actually feel about Dr. King's legacy. Dr. King's words also made him unfavorable with a very powerful group in the South, and that is white Christians and their churches. Dr. King, always willing to collaborate with those who followed Christ in the work of doing justice and making things right for their neighbors, forcefully outed those in the church who chose power over sacrifice, or who chose the peace and purity of the church over justice for all God's people. Indeed, his words claim that, especially for Christians, the measure of peace cannot be the absence of trouble, but must instead be the flourishing of all people. He wrote, quote, "Somehow we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be." So for a church committed to theologies of victory and of favor, to a status quo that maintains power for personal comfort, such words of interdependence wound really deeply. They demonstrate why he was unpopular then and why many white Christians, if we're honest, I think, reject his claims today. But nevertheless, in our decade, Gallup has found that Dr. King has a 94% favorability rating. People feel favorably about him, even those who don't like him. He is celebrated and quoted by many. But I'll close with a simple reminder that we can't love King and pretend like our status quo is just. If we aren't actively dismantling the racial hierarchies embedded all around us, then we're protecting them, even if we don't think we are. Our myths about who we are hard to spot. It's hard for me to see my own blind spots. That's why they're called blind spots. So let's honor King by acknowledging what you think about your status quo, about his actual legacy, not the whitewashed one. Do you lament the mundane trauma of the marginalized, or do you discredit and ignore their hurt? Do you think their hurt is acceptable in the kind of society you want to live in? Do you take the pain of others seriously, or do you trust your own mythology? I really hope that this helps us think about the way that we remember Dr. King and the way that we honor Dr. King. As always, I'm open to talking. I'm open to hearing a different perspective that I've missed. And I hope you enjoy the long weekend. Thanks. Be well.